This presentation is provided by National Seafarers Academy and is designed for mariners studying for their U.S. Merchant Mariner Credential, which is also known as a U.S. Coast Guard license.
This lesson will cover rules of the road numbers 1 through 10 as a combination of the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea, COLREGS, and the inland navigation rules.
The United States Coast Guard is the primary agency responsible for enforcing the navigation rules as well as safety regulations regarding vessels.
The United States Coast Guard has jurisdiction over all United States flagged vessels, vessels entering or leaving United States ports and waters, and all vessels owned by United States citizens.
States and local governments are generally free to enact legislation regarding vessels and their movements where not prohibited by federal law or regulation. The U.S. Coast Guard can and does issue fines under the Administrative Procedures Act for acts by licensed mariners while operating under authority of their license.
In case of an apparent serious marine incident, vessel masters and crew are well advised to limit their discussion with U.S. Coast Guard personnel to matters involving the immediate safety of the passengers, crew and the vessel and cleanup efforts, and to seek the advice of an attorney prior to answering questions or volunteering information beyond the above scope.
Rule number 1 states that these rules apply to all vessels on navigable waters and are mandatory for all vessels.
International rules apply seaward of the demarcation lines, and inland rules apply inland of the demarcation lines.
The rules are not mere prudential regulations, but binding enactments. They are obligatory from the time that the necessity for precaution begins, and continuing so long as the means and opportunity to avoid the danger remain.
An interesting exception to the mandatory application of the rules has been carved out in a case regarding participants in sporting events, for example sailboat racing, under the assumption of risk doctrine. Admiralty courts have found that the participants had contractually opted out of the mandatory application of the rules.
The demarcation lines between international and inland waters are found in 33 CFR and on NOAA charts.
On NOAA charts, the demarcation lines are marked with a dashed magenta line usually located near or at the mouths of inlets and rivers.
Navigable waters are defined as the high seas and all waters connected to the high seas.
The Code of Federal Regulations defines navigable waters as those waters that are subject to the ebb and flow of the tide and/or are presently used, or have been used in the past, or may be susceptible for use to transport interstate or foreign commerce.
Interestingly, the COLREGS apply in some of the waters of
Alaska, Puerto Rico, and parts of Hawaii, Washington State, California, and New England states.
Check with the chart and coast pilot before proceeding into an unfamiliar U.S. port to determine which set of rules applies. In summary, there are two sets of rules, the international rules and the inland rules. It is important for the mariner to know which set of rules applies at the immediate location of the vessel, and that the rules apply alike to all vessels within a jurisdiction, and that the rules are modified by court interpretation.
Every mariner is responsible for knowing and complying with all of the applicable rules on the particular body of water upon which they are navigating.
In addition, states and municipalities may have special regulations that apply on particular bodies of water. The purpose of rule number 2 is to prevent collisions, and is often called the rule of good seamanship, or the general prudential rule.
It is the most important rule that a mariner can know. Its inclusion in the rules is a reminder to the mariner that he is responsible for complying with the rules at all times.
This rule requires the exercise of that degree of the skill and care which are ordinarily to be found in a competent seaman.
Sometimes the mariner has a duty to depart from the rules.
Admiralty courts have ruled
1. There is no right of way on which a vessel is entitled to insist when it is obvious that it will result in danger of collision. 2. Even improper navigation of another vessel does not excuse adherence to a definite rule, when such adherence plainly invites collision, and stubborn adherence to the rule is sometimes culpable fault.
Departure from the rule must be imperatively required by the circumstances. In construing and obeying the rules of navigation, due regard must be to all dangers of navigation, and to any special circumstances which may exist in any particular case, rendering a departure from them necessary in order to avoid immediate danger.
It applies only where there is some special cause rendering a departure necessary to avoid immediate danger, such as an earnest of shallow water, or a concealed rock, the approach of a third vessel, or something of that kind.
However, departure from rules must be only to extent necessary. Admiralty courts have ruled, it is true that there may be extreme cases where departure from their requirements is rendered necessary to avoid impending peril, but only to the extent that such danger demands.
This is a list of items that Admiralty courts have determined good seaman or prudent mariner would do. Additional items that Admiralty courts have determined good seaman or prudent mariner would do.
Rule 2 includes the phrase special circumstances.
Special circumstances are situations in which a departure from the rules may be required.
The mariner is cautioned that the rules are not to be disregarded for convenience or expediency.
Departures from the rules must be imperatively required by the circumstances to save the vessel from immediate danger or to avoid an imminent collision, and must be only to the extent necessary to avoid a danger or collision.
Special circumstances can be divided into two general situations: those not covered by the rules, and those where conformance with the rules is impracticable. Examples in the first category, situations not covered by the rules, include approaching, maneuvering around, or departing docks, slips, piers or anchorages, the presence of more than two vessels, when operating a vessel under oars, when approaching a vessel under oars so as to involve risk of collision. In the second category are situations where the departure from the rules is mandatory, that is, situations in extremis, or through the proposal and assent of all vessels involved in a situation.
In extremis is where collision is imminent.
In these cases, all vessels involved are required to take whatever actions are necessary to avoid collision.
For the give-way vessel, the requirement to maneuver to avoid collision, possibly in violation of the rules, begins from the moment that a risk of collision exists.
For the stand-on vessel, the requirement to maneuver to avoid collision vessel becomes mandatory whenever it becomes apparent that collision cannot be avoided by the action of the give-way vessel alone. But any maneuver in violation of the rules must be only to the extent necessary to avoid the immediate danger. Rule 3 contains general definitions applicable to all vessels in navigation. These definitions are often misunderstood by the mariner, most often when seeking a special privilege that does not exist.
Also discussed are the definitions of vessels underway, insight, and restricted visibility.
The word vessel includes every description of watercraft, including non-displacement craft and seaplanes, used or capable of being used as a means of transportation on water. A power-driven vessel is one that is propelled by machinery.
This includes sailing vessels using their engines.
Although the term machinery is not defined in the rules, it is generally taken to mean an engine, internal combustion, electric or steam, attached to a propeller or paddle wheel, which provides the motive power by turning either in the water or in the air. Manually propelled vessels are not specifically mentioned in the steering and sailing rules, although they are defined as vessels.
Other than an overtaking situation, a vessel approaching a manually propelled vessel and the manually propelled vessel itself are both required to give way when approaching so as to involve risk of collision.
Manually propelled vessels must give way when overtaking another vessel under Rule 13, and are otherwise considered to be in special circumstances when approaching another vessel so as to involve risk of collision.
A manually propelled vessel of less than 20 meters when operating in a narrow channel must not impede the passage of a vessel that can only navigate safely within the narrow channel under Rule 9.
Larger vessels navigating near small vessels, including manually propelled vessels such as canoes or kayaks, must be mindful of their wake and avoid causing any undue damage. A sailing vessel is defined as any vessel under sail provided that propelling machinery, if fitted, is not being used.
Some sailors claim that even though their engines were on, because they were not in gear, they are entitled to claim status as sailing vessels, and all responsibility for a collision rests with the power-driven vessel.
While a sailing vessel with engines on, but not engaged, is indeed a sailing vessel. But such a vessel is unlikely to find favor in the courts, when using the engines might have prevented a collision. A vessel engaged in fishing is one that has fishing apparatus deployed that restricts maneuverability.
The rule specifically states that trolling does not give a vessel special status.
Fishing vessels only have special status when their fishing apparatus is deployed and their maneuverability is encumbered.
At all other times they are considered a normal vessel of their class, power-driven or sailing.
The word seaplane includes any aircraft designed to maneuver on the water. A vessel not under command is defined as a vessel which through some exceptional circumstance is unable to maneuver as required by these rules, and is therefore unable to keep out of the way of another vessel.
The key phrases here are exceptional circumstance and unable to maneuver. Unable to maneuver does not mean inconvenient to maneuver.
The courts are particularly strict with interpretation of the not under command rule. The exceptional circumstance is an impediment, which must be to the vessel, not the crew, and the vessel must be truly unable to maneuver.
In particular, for a power-driven vessel, it means that the vessel is significantly disabled in some way. For example, the steering gear or engine gear has failed such that the vessel cannot maneuver to keep out of the way of other vessels.
Failure to adequately man a vessel is not considered an exceptional circumstance under this rule. A vessel restricted in ability to maneuver is one which by the nature of her work is restricted in her ability to maneuver.
This statement appears to preclude nearly all pleasure vessels from claiming restricted status, except perhaps those engaged in activities such as transferring persons or cargo at sea.
The term vessel restricted in their ability to maneuver shall include but are not limited to
a vessel engaged in laying, servicing, or picking up a navigational mark, submarine cable or pipeline. A vessel engaged in dredging, surveying or underwater operations. A vessel engaged in replenishment or transferring persons, provisions or cargo while underway. A vessel engaged in the launching or recovery of aircraft. A vessel engaged in mine clearance operations. A vessel engaged in a towing operation such as severely restricts the towing vessel and her tow and their ability to deviate from their course. Vessels undertaking routine towing operations are precluded from claiming restricted status.
The definition of a vessel constrained by her draft contained in International Rule 3 does not appear in the inland rules.
The term vessel constrained by her draft means a power-driven vessel which, because of her draft in relation to the available depth and width of navigable water, is severely restricted in her ability to deviate from the course she is following.
In the adoption of the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea, testimony indicated that due to the many shallow waters in the United States and the large number of pleasure vessels using these waters, there was substantial likelihood of confusion in the application of the rules regarding this class of vessel.
Thus, the inland rules do not contain any rules recognizing vessels constrained by draft.
A wing and ground craft is a vessel which operates on a cushion of air, enabling it to fly over the surface of the water. The vessels are often capable of speeds over 100 miles per hour.
Within the context of the international rules only, they considered to be equivalent to power-driven vessels in some cases and equivalent to seaplanes in other situations.
A vessel underway is one that is neither aground, at anchor, nor made fast to the shore.
A vessel underway but not making way is one that is not moving relative to the waters in which it is resting, although it may be moving over ground due to the effects of current. Adrift is considered underway.
A vessel underway and making way is one which is moving relative to the waters in which it is navigating. The words length and breadth of a vessel means her length overall and greatest breadth. A vessel is in sight of another only when it can be observed visually from the other vessel.
A vessel that can only be observed on radar is not considered in sight.
The ability to observe the other vessel does not necessarily occur at the same time on two vessels operating near each other.
It is entirely possible to have one vessel operating under Rule 19 and another vessel operating under Rules 11 through 18 when the vessels are operating in or near conditions of restricted visibility.
Restricted visibility refers to situations where the weather or weather-related cause restricts normal visibility.
The restricted visibility rule does not apply to situations where there are intervening obstructions such as piers, docks, other vessels or spits of land that cause other vessels to be obscured, nor does mere darkness constitute restricted visibility.
The Rule 19 applies exclusively to vessels in conditions of restricted visibility. Rules in this section apply to any condition of visibility.
Rule 4 states that Rules 5 through 10 applies to all vessels in navigation at all times, that is without regard to visibility. Rules 11 through 18 apply to vessels in sight of one another.
And Rule 19 applies only to vessels operating in or near areas of restricted visibility. Every vessel shall at all times maintain a proper lookout by sight and hearing as well as by all available means appropriate in the prevailing circumstances and conditions so as to make a full appraisal of the situation and of the risk of collision.
Here are some Admiralty Court rulings with regard to lookout. 1. The obligation to maintain a proper lookout applies equally to small vessels as it does to large vessels. 2. On vessels where there is an unobstructed all-round view provided at the steering station, the watch officer or helmsman may safely serve as a lookout. However, it is expected that this practice will only be followed after the situation has been carefully assessed on each occasion, and it has been clearly established that it is prudent to do so. Full account shall be taken of all relevant factors, including but not limited to the state of the weather, conditions of visibility, traffic density, and proximity of navigational hazards. 3. An inefficient lookout is equivalent to none. A proper lookout is one that is vigilantly maintained by a competent person of suitable experience. 4. Lookouts must have no other duties to perform. Excuses for failure to post a lookout in dense fog, such as age, state of tiredness, vision acuity or need to prepare bait are unacceptable. 5. The lookout is required by good navigation to be placed at the point best suited for the purpose alike of hearing and observing the approach of objects likely to be brought into collision with the vessel, having regard to the circumstances of the case and the condition of the weather. 6. The courts have been rigid in holding vessels to maintaining lookout as far forward and as near the water as possible. Especially when the water is dark, it is important that the lookout should be as near it as possible, in order that his eye may follow the surface, and thus be in a position to detect anything low down.
Rule number 6 is the safe speed rule, and is often misunderstood. Many mariners simply ignore the rule or mistake it as applying only to the immediate condition of their own vessel.
In fact, the safe speed restriction is considered in terms of the relation of a vessel to other vessels, structures and persons, the weather and sea conditions, and the maneuvering capabilities of the vessel.
The rule itself gives factors, which are to be taken into account by all vessels, and lists additional factors to be taken into account by vessels equipped with radar.
The safe speed rule is a mandatory requirement that in all conditions of visibility, vessels proceed at a speed such that they can effectively avoid collision or damage to other vessels or property. In addition, the safe speed rule specifically limits vessels underway to speeds at which they can be stopped before colliding with another vessel.
In determining a safe speed, the capabilities or limitations of the vessel may be an issue.
Specifically, a large vessel that can only maintain steerage at a speed that causes a wake sufficient to damage vessels properly docked or moored along its intended route must obtain assistance from tugs to proceed at a slower speed and avoid causing wake damage.
A safe speed is not the same as a moderate speed. Additionally, vessels have been found liable for getting underway when conditions were such that no speed could be considered safe, or for failing to anchor in restricted visibility.
Since there is a strong presumption of fault against the moving vessel under Admiralty law, mariners are well advised to slow to the minimum speed necessary to maintain steerage when in waters near harbors, wharves, piers, swimmers, rafters, narrow channels, no-wake zones, and other vessels underway or at anchor.
In determining a safe speed, the following factors shall be among those taken into account.
The state of visibility. The traffic density including concentrations of fishing vessels or any other vessels. The manageability of the vessel with special reference to stopping distance and turning ability in the prevailing conditions. At night, the presence of background lights such as from shore lights or from backscatter from her own lights. The state of wind, sea and current, and the proximity of navigational hazards. The draft in relation to the available depth of water.
The characteristics, efficiency and limitations of the radar equipment.
Any constraints imposed by the radar range scale in use. The effect on radar detection of the sea state, weather and other sources of interference. The possibility that small vessels, ice and other floating objects may not be detected by radar at an adequate range. The number, location and movement of vessels detected by radar. The more exact assessment of the visibility that may be possible when radar is used to determine the range of vessels or other objects in the vicinity.
Rule number 7 applies to all vessels in navigation, and it provides specific direction to the mariner for use in determining risk of collision. Of particular importance in this rule is the prohibition against making assumptions using scanty information, especially radar information.
Also mentioned as a factor in determining the risk of collision is the use of compass bearings and the solemn warning that if there is any doubt about a situation, then a risk of collision is deemed to exist. Risk of collision indicates a period before the risk has actually matured. It means a period at which there is a probability that there will be a risk of collision if precautions are not taken.
The requirement to use all available means to determine if there is a risk of collision requires the use of radar if equipped, even in clear weather, use of VHF radio, binoculars, the taking of compass bearings and the plotting of the other vessel's positions. Proper use shall be made of radar equipment if fitted and operational, including long-range scanning to obtain early warning of risk of collision and radar plotting or equivalent systematic observation of detected objects.
Even continuous observation by a competent person is unlikely to be accepted as proper use of radar to obtain early warning of risk of collision if the bearings and distances of approaching vessels are not taken at regular intervals and carefully evaluated by plotting or by some equivalent method.
Assumptions shall not be made on the basis of scanty information, especially scanty radar information. In determining if risk of collision exists, the following considerations shall be among those taken into account.
There is a duty to watch compass bearings. If the bearing does not change appreciably, then a close quarters situation is developing. When this is confirmed, avoiding action should be taken in ample time. Such risk may sometimes exist even when an appreciable bearing change is evident, particularly when approaching a very large vessel or atoll, or when approaching a vessel at close range.
Rule number 8 applies to all vessels in navigation.
The rule discusses the various actions to be taken by the stand-on and give-way vessels to avoid collision.
Rule number 8 lists several positive requirements in regards to collision avoidance. They are that actions to avoid collision shall be positive, made in ample time, be large enough to be readily observed, a series of small course changes is prohibited, and result in passing at a safe distance.
A further requirement is that vessels slow or stop if necessary to avoid collision or to assess the situation.
There are also several prohibitions in Rule number 8.
They are that a succession of small course changes is to be avoided, that alteration of course alone must not result in another close quarters situation, and that any action taken must result in passing at a safe distance.
Any alteration of course and/or speed to avoid collision shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, be large enough to be readily apparent to another vessel observing visually or by radar.
A succession of small alterations of course and/or speed should be avoided.
If there is sufficient sea room, alteration of course alone may be the most effective action to avoid a close quarters situation provided that it is made in good time, is substantial and does not result in another close quarters situation. Action taken to avoid collision with another vessel shall be such as to result in passing at a safe distance. The effectiveness of the action shall be carefully checked until the other vessel is finally passed and clear. If necessary to avoid collision or allow more time to assess the situation, a vessel may slacken her speed or take all way off by stopping or reversing her means of propulsion. Rule number 8 contains a paragraph F with 3 sub-paragraphs which regulate the conduct of vessels required not to impede others' vessels.
The requirement not to impede is not as strong as the requirement to keep out of the way of as discussed in Rule number 16, which covers action by give-way vessels.
A vessel proceeding along the course of a narrow channel or fairway shall keep as near to the outer limit of the channel or fairway which lies on her starboard side as is safe and practicable.
Rule number 9 applies to all vessels operating in narrow channels in any condition of visibility.
There is no definition of a narrow channel in Rule 3, nor does the Coast Guard make official designations of narrow channels.
Therefore, the status of a waterway as a narrow channel is defined by the courts as a question of law and fact together.
It is not necessary that a waterway be confined within banks in order to be considered a narrow channel, nor is a canal or a river necessarily considered a narrow channel on that fact alone.
A waterway customarily navigated in opposite directions may be considered a narrow channel, even if it is surrounded by waters navigable by shallow draft vessels. Sailboats, vessels under 20 meters in length, and fishing vessels are specifically required not to impede vessels that can only navigate within the confines of a narrow channel. A vessel engaged in fishing shall not impede the passage of any other vessel navigating within a narrow channel or fairway.
Rule number 9 does not override the normal overtaking, crossing and meeting rules for power-driven vessels. Narrow channels, COLREGS only.
In a narrow channel or fairway, when overtaking can take place only if the vessel to be overtaken has to take action to permit safe passing, the vessel intending to overtake shall indicate her intention by sounding the appropriate signal prescribed in Rule 34, c.I. The vessel to be overtaken shall, if in agreement, sound the appropriate signal prescribed in Rule 34, c.2, and take steps to permit safe passing. If in doubt, she may sound the signals prescribed in Rule 34d.
Overtaking in a narrow channel, COLREGS only. At Sharon, when vessels A and B are in sight of each other, and B must take action to permit safe passing. Overtaking in a narrow channel, COLREGS only. At Sharon, when tow power-driven vessels A and B are in sight of each other, and B does not need to take action to permit safe passing. Overtaking in a narrow channel, inland only. At Sharon, when two power-driven vessels A and B are in sight of each other, and B does not need to take action to permit safe passing. Overtaking in a narrow channel, Great Lakes and Western Rivers only. A power-driven vessel operating in narrow channels or fairways on the Great Lakes, Western Rivers, or waters specified by the Secretary, and proceeding downbound with the following current shall have the right of way over an upbound vessel, shall propose the manner and place of passage, and shall initiate the maneuvering signals.
The vessel proceeding upbound against the current shall hold as necessary to permit safe passing.
This rule does not relieve the overtaking vessel of her obligation under Rule 13, Overtaking. A vessel nearing a bend or an area of a narrow channel or fairway, where other vessels may be obscured by an intervening obstruction, shall navigate with particular alertness and caution, and shall sound the appropriate signal of when prolonged. Any vessel shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, avoid anchoring in a narrow channel. Rule number 10. Traffic separation schemes are intended to help avoid collisions in archipelagic seaways.
Traffic separation schemes are distinct from both vessel traffic service areas and regulated navigation areas.
Vessels transiting a traffic separation scheme area are not exempted from the normal collision regulations.
Vessels not using the traffic lanes are directed to avoid the area by as wide a margin as possible, and all vessels are directed to avoid anchoring in a traffic separation scheme area, particularly near its terminations. Vessels crossing a traffic zone must do so at right angles to the normal flow of traffic in the zone.
All vessels approaching a traffic separation scheme area are required to navigate with particular caution near the terminations of the area. A vessel using a traffic separation scheme shall
proceed in the appropriate traffic lane in the general direction of traffic flow for that lane. So far as is practicable, keep clear of a traffic separation line or separation zone. Normally join or leave a traffic lane at the termination of the lane, but when joining or leaving from either side shall do so at as small an angle to the general direction of traffic flow as practicable. A vessel shall, so far as practicable, avoid crossing traffic lanes, but if obliged to do so shall cross on a heading as nearly as practicable at right angles to the general direction of traffic flow. A vessel shall not use an inshore traffic zone when she can safely use the appropriate traffic lane within the adjacent traffic separation scheme. However, vessels of less than 20 meters in length, sailing vessels and vessels engaged in fishing may use the inshore traffic zone. Notwithstanding Rule 10(d)(i), a vessel may use an inshore traffic zone when en route to or from a port, offshore installation or structure, pilot station or any other place situated within the inshore traffic zone, or to avoid immediate danger. A vessel, other than a crossing vessel or a vessel joining or leaving a lane, shall not normally enter a separation zone or cross a separation line except I. in cases of emergency to avoid immediate danger. 2. To engage in fishing within a separation zone. A vessel navigating in areas near the terminations of traffic separation schemes shall do so with particular caution. A vessel shall, so far as practicable, avoid anchoring in a traffic separation scheme or in areas near its terminations. A vessel not using a traffic separating scheme shall avoid it by as wide a margin as is practicable. A vessel engaged in fishing shall not impede the passage of any vessel following a traffic lane. A vessel of less than 20 meters in length or a sailing vessel shall not impede the safe passage of a power-driven vessel following a traffic lane. A vessel restricted in her ability to maneuver when engaged in an operation for the maintenance of safety of navigation in a traffic separation scheme is exempted from complying with this rule to the extent necessary to carry out the operation. A vessel restricted in her ability to maneuver when engaged in an operation for the laying, servicing or picking up of a submarine cable, within a traffic separation scheme, is exempted from complying with this rule to the extent necessary to carry out the operation.
For questions, please contact National Seafarers Academy by emailing info@natsea.com.
Thanks for watching.